Greetings from Brussels. I'm going to tell you in about 20 minutes what we are doing at the European level at the moment. That does not mean that in Ireland you have to do everything exactly the same. We do it at the EU level, but nevertheless, I believe that it gives a strategic framework in which also that can give some guidance on what needs to happen in Ireland, knowing that obviously every member state has different priorities. But if we do not implement what we have decided at the European level in each of the member states making their own contribution, we will obviously not achieve our EU objectives. Now, we have our own EU biodiversity strategy. As with all the EU member states, the EU itself is also a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we also have our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. You call it your Biodiversity Action Plan. We call it our EU Biodiversity Strategy. And 2 years ago, we adopted the one that sets very concrete targets and measures until the year 2030. When we developed this new strategy, we obviously were using the experience with previous strategies we had. And there we just had to realize that our ambitious goals we had in past strategies, despite all the efforts that were done also in Ireland in implementing the nature legislation and integrating biodiversity and other services, did not lead to a change of course. We are continuing to lose biodiversity in the EU. And that is because the wider destructive practices, the intensification of land use, are overarchingly impacting biodiversity as compared to the successes that we had through the successful conservation and restoration actions that we have done. The other ingredient was science, and we have used particularly the landmark report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, that in its global assessment not only draw a very bleak picture of what's happening with biodiversity worldwide in the EU, saying that if we do not engage in a fundamental and big transformative change, we will lose 1 million species in the next decade. And they also identified what are the key reasons for that major loss of biodiversity, the direct causes. And these are land use change, so the transformation of biodiverse forests, biodiverse habitats, peatlands, marine areas into more intensive other types of land uses, the overexploitation, particularly of our fisheries resources, climate change itself is a big impact on biodiversity, pollution, such as pesticides and other pollutants, and invasive alien species, not to be forgotten, which is increasingly also threatening our native biological diversity. So we wanted to develop a very ambitious new biodiversity strategy that has, as much as possible, very concrete, ambitious but achievable, measurable targets, and then a series of measures on how we are getting there. I must say that biodiversity, and it's also heartening to see the previous speakers, that it is now a big priority for Ireland. It is also for the EU. Since I'm working on biodiversity in the European Commission, never has been nature and biodiversity so high on the political agenda. It is an essential part of the European Green Deal, which in itself is a key top priority of this new von der Leyen Commission. And that's why also the development of this strategy was done through a true whole of government approach, many services in the Commission being involved in co-defining that strategy. And it's, for example, not a coincidence that the Farm to Fork strategy was adopted the same day as the EU biodiversity strategy. The strategy has 4 key pillars. The first one on protecting biodiversity and nature, the second on restoring nature, the third on creating the right enabling environment for implementing those, and the fourth is on our global dimension and ambition. And I will tell you very briefly on what is in this, and particularly where we are and what are the next challenges in implementing and achieving those targets. The first pillar is on protecting nature, and here we have set ourselves the objective to put at least 30% of our land and sea, each of them 30%, in protected areas or other effective area-based conservation measures. And a third of that should be strictly protected. That does not mean that in each member state, they should also have 30% of their land and seas protected and a third of which strictly protected. But collectively in the EU, everybody needs to do more in order to have more protected areas so that collectively we achieve this target. And the Commission recently issued a guidance document that outlines more clearly what do we mean by strict protection, how do you prioritize the identification of new areas, what are other effective area-based conservation measures, etc. So now over to you, and it's really for member states like Ireland to start looking into designating more of those protected areas and also ensuring that they are not only on paper, but they are also effectively managed so that they deliver the reasons for which they have been protected. The second, and I would say major and biggest block of our new biodiversity strategy is the EU Nature Restoration Plan. Not only are we developing new legislation, and we will soon present our proposal for a new nature restoration law, which really aims at having very concrete legally binding targets that make it legally binding for member states to, for example, achieve a certain percentage of the Annex 1 habitats from the Habitats Directive in a good condition by a certain date. For example, to also identify and remove rivers that are obsolete so as to contribute to the EU-wide target of having 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers, to have a certain amount of green spaces in urban areas and also tree cover in urban areas, to have to halt and reverse the decline of pollinator populations, to also have an increase of farmland bird populations, to restore peatlands under agricultural use. You should know that 3% of the agricultural land has drained peatlands that were formerly peatlands or other organic soils. And on those 3%, 25% of the emissions from agricultural land are being generated. So if you want to promote nature-based solutions to have a win-win between the climate and the nature agenda, this is certainly a low-hanging fruit where one needs to invest into transforming those areas back into restoring peatlands. We also want to have a positive trend in certain indicators that are particularly relevant in how biodiverse, how nature is doing in, for example, agriculture and forest areas like deadwood, like forest connectivity, like soil organic carbon, both on agriculture and forests, like butterfly populations, etc. And at the center of it, there should be a national restoration plans that the member states should develop in order to demonstrate how they are going to implement all of that. So these are the ideas. Obviously, we need to wait for the final discussions in the Commission, and we hope that indeed the nature restoration law will be adopted soon. It's being scheduled to be confirmed on the 22nd of June. We are working very hard towards meeting that deadline, but you never know, there can always be last-minute changes, as happened. It was foreseen in March, and because of the Ukraine war, we had to postpone the adoption of this nature restoration law. I already mentioned in talking about the nature restoration law some key aspects of the EU Nature Restoration Plan. On top of that, there are wider measures in having more biodiversity, more nature on agricultural land. And in that context, I would mention, for example, the CAP strategic plans that are really an essential instrument in order to put the right enabling framework so that farmers get the rewards that they need in order to engage in this transformative change. It was already mentioned by Minister Hackett that the Commission made some observations on also the Irish CAP strategic plan, and I really hope that those can be taken into account, because this will determine the priorities for funding in agriculture from using this big CAP money that is available for the next 6 years to come. So it's absolutely essential that those opportunities from eco schemes, from agri-environmental climate measures, etc., are used in order to support biodiversity also from the in the farming sector. On forestry, we have issued a EU forestry strategy, and we are now developing a forest monitoring legislation in order to have better information and better data on key attributes of forestry. The key is really to move away from that monocultural intensive forest management towards a more biodiverse, nature-oriented type of forest management in order to not stop producing wood, on the contrary, but really have a more resilient forest in the EU that will also be more resilient towards climate effects, droughts, and other issues that are happening around us. I already mentioned the free-flowing river objective. We also have measures in this nature restoration plan to reduce pollution. Together with the nature restoration plan, the Commission will also issue a proposal for revision of the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive, which will be a new regulation. And here we want to make it legally binding and make it very concrete on how to achieve the objective that is both in the Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategy, to reduce the risk and use of pesticides by 50% by 2030. We also have provisions in there to fully implement our invasive alien species legislation. We also have provisions there dealing with urban biodiversity. We want urban areas to develop their own urban greening plans in order to really embed more green into urban planning procedures. And we see that a lot of cities are also taking their responsibility by engaging and adopting their own biodiversity targets and objective. Because as it was said, biodiversity is not only a whole of government issue, it also needs to be a whole of society issue. So every citizen, or every local authority, every parts of government need to be fully involved when we develop that. I think I mentioned the key issues. We obviously also have activities on marine biodiversity, but I will now move to the third pillar, which are the enabling conditions. And here we work not only on a better governance, on better knowledge. We are developing a dashboard in which everybody can see how much are we collectively actually achieving in going towards the targets that we have adopted ourselves. We have an actions tracker in which each of the 100 plus actions in the strategy is being tracked, and we can see if it's green, it has been implemented, or it's being in progress, or it's being delayed. We also have created a new EU biodiversity partnership, which involves member state representatives and representatives of civil society to discuss with us the challenges and the progress made in implementing the biodiversity strategy. Very important is obviously financing. We had set ourselves in the strategy to mobilize 20 billion euro per year for biodiversity. And since then, there has been really a very important decision by the co-decision makers, the co-legislators, the Parliament and the Council and the Commission to earmark 7.5% of the whole EU budget by 2024 for biodiversity, and then in the end of this budget period, 2026 and 2027, to reach 10% of that budget to be earmarked for biodiversity. And we have developed a new tracking methodology in order to really be able to see, are we making progress towards that? But again, it will depend a lot on what the member state themselves prioritize, not only in the CAP strategic plans, but also, for example, in their operational programs, on the structural funds, how much they are using the opportunities for the LIFE projects. Horizon Europe is also a very important instrument in which we have now more than ever possibilities to support biodiversity. A new biodiversity partnership was launched involving nearly all the member states and research authorities here that will mobilize 300 million euros for research and knowledge generation and monitoring. We have established a new knowledge center for biodiversity in order to put really all the knowledge and all the information in a one-stop shop online available for everybody. And in that context, it's also important that we mobilize the youth and we educate people, that we integrate better biodiversity in our educational programs, and that we also develop the skills that are necessary in order to implement our strategy. We hear it a lot from the member states that they actually don't have enough people to implement all of that, to monitor biodiversity, to talk to the farmers and to the forest owners and to the others, to take them on board in this transformative change. So the recent announcements of increasing staff and funding that I've heard this morning are extremely encouraging also from a European perspective. Another important aspect is that we mobilize the private sector and the financial sector. It was already mentioned by Elizabeth Bremer. We have an EU business and biodiversity platform in which we work with business and financial institutions to allow them to make the increasingly commitments that are being made by a lot of key players that they want to become nature positive by 2030, to develop tools so they can really make that a reality in their own decision making. So having tools that allow them to assess their dependency on biodiversity, their impacts on biodiversity, so they can take the right decisions to reduce that impact and to really become a nature positive if they're not already are so far. Very important is that we also increase the cooperation with the climate agenda, that we really implement and achieve the goal of becoming climate neutral continent by 2050 and having our biodiversity and nature loss stopped and reversed, going hand in hand. And there are so many possible win-win solutions. We have seen in the past that we embarked in some climate solutions that were negative for biodiversity, like relying more and more on renewable biofuels, for example. I think here we have to make sure that we promote nature-based solutions. I already mentioned the protection and restoration of wetlands or of old growth, more biodiversity forests as key elements in that context. There are many more things in that part, but I will now finish by the international part. Obviously, we are, as the EU, and also thanks for Ireland for engaging very constructively with that, I would say internationally, very much championing the adoption of a very ambitious global biodiversity framework. With this EU biodiversity strategy, we wanted to set the scene and to demonstrate already in advance that we are ready to lead by example. We also have adopted a number of other legislative proposals, for example, a new law that will make it mandatory for everybody who is importing certain commodities like palm oil, soya, and others to demonstrate that those commodities do not contribute towards deforestation in other areas, and many more activities we are doing on the global agenda to really make sure that not only in the EU, but also we support our partner countries in order to get them also having more action being done on nature and biodiversity. So this is what is happening and what is going to happen on our EU biodiversity strategy. I will only repeat that whatever we do, if we don't have people that make it happen on the ground, the farmers, the citizens, the forest owners, the fishermen, the local authority decision makers, we will never achieve any of our, be it national or EU targets. And we very much count on the efforts of all the member states to make what they can in that effort. And therefore, I very much welcome what I've already heard this morning about all what has been done recently and all what is planned under this government in the Republic of Ireland. That is very encouraging. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily enough. I guess you will discuss that in the next 2 days. There is always more and better that can be done. It is very important that this is not seen as only something for environmental authorities, that this is really seen, biodiversity and nature is at the core, or has to be at the core of every department, of every ministry, because we have seen with the COVID pandemic, it has been said by other speakers that having healthy ecosystems, having more nature around us is not only essential for our own human health and well-being, physical health and mental health, but, and the World Economic Forum has said it, our GDP depends, more than half of our GDP depends on having healthy ecosystems. So nature is essential for our social and economic future. And with this, I wish you a very successful National Second Biodiversity Conference. I'm looking forward to hear about the results of your discussions in the next 2 weeks. And again, greetings from Brussels and greetings from Europe. Thank you.